now we go to the panel discussion on data-driven services to the connected vehicle. And as promised, we have different voices. We have Maarten Klemmer, Governmental Affairs Manager, Ford Motor Company. We have Andrei Iordache, Director of Industry Solutions at HERE Technologies. Welcome, Andrei. This is automotive location-based software and AI, right? Is that about right? Okay. And Antonio Biason, bon dia.
Bon dia.
Legal and Policy Officer, DG CNECT, Data Policy and Innovation Unit. I might mention you used to be with the Portuguese Perm Rep. That's all. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah. So you know kind of how it works from the national angle in dealing with European level regulation as well. Let's get started with Maarten. And we did talk a little bit about this, about trying to strike this balance. And what about between balancing data security with services? Can you address that?
Right. Thanks so much, Chris. I think one image that I'm seeing in Brussels more and more is the smartphone on wheels, as they would call a connected vehicle. And I think it's not fitting at all, coming back to your question about security. Because if you think about it, the worst thing that can go wrong if you have a problem with your smartphone on the data side, you have a frozen screen. Quite annoying, maybe you need to restart, maybe you lose some data, fair enough. But with a vehicle that weighs 2 tons, runs through the city with passengers on board and pedestrians around, that is a completely different story.
Right.
Hence, safety and security of the vehicle, also in sharing data when talking about connected vehicles, is our primary concern as a vehicle manufacturer. And that is also enshrined in the way we share data, right? The data is always shared in a safe and secure way, and it's not done directly from the vehicle. It is done via an external server where then third parties or whoever can access, and they don't need to directly connect to the vehicle in order to minimize these kind of threats.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's the architectural side. And then, as we discussed earlier on, there's the consumer side, the consent side, and we can discuss about later on if you want. But I'd say vehicle data sharing it's like a romance, nothing without consent, right?
Okay.
So you always need the consumer, to consent in terms of data sharing. Maybe with us as a manufacturer, maybe with third parties, or the European Commission. We had that question earlier. I think that's important to keep in mind.
Okay. There's also the issue of customer benefit from this data. Can you talk about that, about how you see vehicle-generated data contributing to enhancing the customer's experience with that vehicle?
It's a good point. I mean, I think we touched upon that first with Christian and later on also with Federico, who presented the study. I think it's one of the key aspects. And what we see is that customers only want to share data if they see a tangible benefit. They don't share data for whatever reason. They need to see the benefits for them. And those kind of benefits, they vary, as we heard, between commercial customers, between private use cases. That is really, really different. I'd say one of the key aspects, of course, is that we as a manufacturer meet those demands, may it be commercial or private. And we had that interjection earlier from the gentleman that I don't see anymore from the lease side, where he asked, what do I do? I want to have that service, but I don't get it.
Yep.
And I always remember BlackBerry as, the market leader in connected services at some point. But they disappeared. And why is that? Because they didn't meet the consumer demand. The BlackBerry phones did not cater the needs what consumers wanted. They wanted apps, they wanted data sharing. In the end, you had iPhones and Android phones and whatever, but no BlackBerries anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think that is kind of the situation that can exist and that we, of course, don't want to be in as a manufacturer, right?
And can we zoom out to the more societal issues of reducing emissions, improving road safety? How can that connectivity and that access to that data help contribute to that?
That's a good point, because I think we had those questions twice already from the Commission and from our Belgian colleague and even the Dutch Perm Rep.
Yeah, road safety, yeah.
So we at Ford, we're proud members of the Data for Road Safety Alliance, which is an alliance that brings together vehicle manufacturers, but also suppliers and technology providers like HERE. We also have member states that are present. And what we do there is we share certain data points to improve road safety free for all. So everybody that's contributing gets access to this network of road safety data. And what it does, it gives you alerts in the vehicle if you have different conditions on the road. For example, the weather is changing and you have a fog coming up. Or I had that recently when I was driving towards Liège, and suddenly my vehicle told me that, there are people on the road.
Yep.
I was like, what is that happening? And actually, 500 meters further, there was a car broken down and people were on the side street trying to get out of that vehicle. So it's quite an important tool, a tool that can really be beneficial for people and the society as a whole. But it's also, I think, a good example of sharing or showing what can happen when everyone pulls together on the same string, right?
And reducing emissions, can you talk about that?
Reducing emissions, I think one of the tools that works, and Christian has touched upon that, is cooperation with energy services provider. He mentioned Tiber and Octopus Energy that Ford is working with. And what you can do there is, if you're an electric vehicle owner, you can make sure that your car is always charged with renewable energy. Because there might be certain times when there's more renewable energy in the network because the sun is shining or there's more wind. And here you can actually put that as a preference, and you can reduce costs because you want to charge at peak hours or off-peak hours, and you can make sure that your electric vehicle is only charged with sustainable, renewable energy. And I think that is quite something that eases the life of consumers in their daily use of the vehicle, but also brings back that aspect of reducing emissions and reducing CO2 footprint of usage of a vehicle.
Okay. Keep in mind, #FutureDriven for anything you hear during this panel. And have your questions ready as well, because we'll get to your questions after a bit of Q&A between me and the panel. And let me go to Andrei at Here Technologies, customer services. Now, obviously, you're offering customer services. Tell us about what Here does.
Yeah, so we are a location data platform company. So basically, what we do, we're solving location problems. We are starting from data, what's out there in the world, and we're turning it into actionable insights. These actionable insights could be a map that you can navigate, safety services, traffic, EV, you name it. So most of the things, and luckily in automotive, cars are meant to, let's say, are a tool to go from location A to location B. So from that perspective, location data and location information is part of the journey. From this perspective, this is what we do. We operate in the space of, let's say, navigation, infotainment, but more recently, we actually had a big growth in the space of ADAS and automated driving. And there was, I think even earlier, there was a conversation about automated driving with Mercedes and BMW being the first one on the road with level 3. We are proud and happy to be part of this difficult journey to put level 3 in production on European roads.
Okay, and then how do you prioritize which services to offer based on this data?
Yeah, so I think there's always a combination of two factors, right? So one hand is the use case and the business model around the use case, and the second part is also kind of like what technology exists in the market. And let me give you an example for that. So many of the use cases that we're deploying, they're either tied to a safety benefit or efficiency benefit and so on, that mostly the OEMs would be interested to have, either to, let's say, increase safety, or for example, for NCAP, or data for road safety is a good example. So that's kind of like, we're looking at what the market demand is. But the second thing, there are also things about what's out there that we can actually leverage. And let me give you an example to what you said with hazard warnings. Like, for example, in most of the cases now, when you know a hazard, you know that there's a hazard on a section of the road. But in many cases, there will be scenarios where maybe there's a pothole or like something broken down, but it's not on the road, it's on a specific lane. Now, from this perspective, there are very few vehicles out there that have true lane level positioning. These would be the ones that can drive themselves, that can, they can tell with a really precise point that they are on the lane. So that's the kind of things, this would be a very interesting use case, but we need first to see the technology and the vehicles on the road, that they are coming new with new capabilities and new capturing of information, and also localizing this information better than the existing fleet. And this is where new cases could come up.
Okay, and in your opinion, this data information is flowing in a proper way, according to you?
So maybe let me take a step back. We started, building maps more than 30 years ago.
Right.
In the beginning, we used to do ourselves the data collection. We had vehicles and mapping in manually. This over time has changed quite a lot. So maybe the first example was traffic, where you have probe data coming from vehicles and you built the traffic. Then there are examples like safety, where now you can get information regarding warnings and you build safety and so on. So it's increasing, and even for our, let's say, main scope of building maps, most of in the areas where there's a good density of EVs, we can actually build map features to a large degree coming from the vehicle perception data. Of course, and also I want to build on what our four colleagues said.
Yeah.
It's all coming with safety and consent. So ourselves, we don't get the data directly from the vehicle. We actually get it from an agreement and existing with the OEM from the back end, fully anonymized. We're not in the business of getting the user data and doing something else with it. We're in the business of getting the location data insights and turning them into something that is useful for drivers.
All right. Well, let me move on to Antonio and this Data Act. It really comes into force, well, soon, I guess. What impact, and it's a huge data act, so that you can't, I mean, there's only so much you can say, but I mean, on this vehicle data, what impact do you hope to see, does the European Commission hope to see?
The Data Act is indeed a massive piece of legislation. It will enter into application on 12th of September 2025. So now is really the right time to start looking at the products that you might have, be it a vehicle, because that's only one, and it really crosses the board in terms of from electric toothbrush to airplanes, right? Everything in between, of course.
Yeah.
So it's a good time to look at the data that your product is generating. It's a good time to look at the contracts that you already have and see how exactly it's, well, if it's up to date or if it's in line with the principles of the Data Act and the rules therein as well. So I'm coming a little bit, let's say, more from the horizontal perspective. So it's really great to hear on the ground examples of how exactly data sharing is taking place.
Yeah, indeed, right.
But I think that the Data Act also is geared towards not only automotive sector, of course, and we know that the automotive sector is really the central engine of competitiveness in Europe, or at least one of them. And so it's good that the more we talk to stakeholders that are trying to learn about the Data Act, trying to update their business models so that they can really benefit from the Data Act, the more we see this shift in mentality towards, in the mid 2010s, perhaps thinking about data more about, I'm going to hold the data because someone told me it's valuable. But now moving into a data sharing economy. So much so that if you're sharing data, you're also, you can also get data. Mm-hmm. So seeing how these business models are changing is extremely interesting, and it is happening. And the Data Act, from the perspective of the automotive sector, really has a lot to benefit. I think from the perspective of how to find this benefit, it's interesting to see that a lot of the work that we were doing in the Data Act was trying to find the right balance between those like automotive OEMs that have to, invest in the data generation technologies, really build the car, so to speak. But the car is no longer, of course, I'm speaking to kind of, what's the expression, I'm preaching to the choir, right? A car is no longer just hardware, it's becoming more and more about the software that it's embedded in it.
Yeah.
So seeing...
A mobile phone on wheels, as we said.
Or no longer even, something we're moving
even
past
more
that,
than
even
that.
more than that. The software-defined vehicles conversation is extremely interesting as well.
The PC on wheels.
Exactly, something like that. But so I wanted to talk about the balance, right? The balance between OEM manufacturers and also the balance of those who actually pay for the product. So they themselves can also benefit from, getting access to the data that their product is using.
Yeah.
So the Data Act is all about this. So, for instance, there may be situations where a user has their product and can get access to the product for free. But if the user asks the data holder to share their data with someone else, then the data holder can request compensation. So that's just one element or just one example of how the balance can be found. Another one that's usually a little bit more under the radar is the remedies that the Data Act puts in place for whenever there is misuse of data, and what the data holder, third party, what have you, can request the other party who has done the misuse to do. So it really is, the Data Act ultimately represents a huge power shift in the data world, and there will be a very interesting economy and topic to follow.
Yeah, I see the description of it on the European Commission page on that. It says it quote, removes barriers to access data, preserves incentives to invest in data generation, and unlocks the value of the data. Do you hope to see those three impacts quickly, or is that going to take time?
I think with such a change in how we think about a resource and assets, these things will take time. It's just, just like, for example, looking at the Data Governance Act, which is, let's say, the sister piece of legislation under the framework of the European Data Strategy. And there's a lot of, a big push and pull relationship, if you will. We need to make sure that, for example, the member states designate the competent authorities that are needed to really, make the structures embedded in the Data Governance Act work. So in the Data Act context, potentially the same thing will happen. We need to make sure that we have the right framework, so at the enforcement level, but also, and this is where businesses are absolutely essential, to make sure that they themselves are also ready. Because come 12th of September 2025, and talking to various people, I think that there's two camps here. There's the business camp that essentially says, okay, we need to make changes to the way we do things around here. We need to think about data differently. And the businesses themselves, they might be users of other products. So it really is a cascade effect, so to speak. But on the side of consumers as well, come 12th of September 2025, they can also start asking for access to their data. So it will take some time, but I do see it as quite a steep curve.
And what about the aspect of interoperability? I mean, that's going to take time too, right?
Yes.
What measures is the Commission considering to promote interoperability?
I recently heard, apologies, no.
Well, or is it built into this Data Act, or is that another step?
It's absolutely built into the Data Act, because interoperability is for all things data to flow in the economy. And I recently heard this very interesting analogy about interoperability, which is it's like building a house, and we need to make sure that we're using bricks that have the same size, because otherwise it's not going to work. It's not going to be efficient. So from that perspective, it really is a multi-layered approach here that the Commission is doing. In the Data Act, there is Article 33 that talks about participants of data spaces having to comply with essential requirements for the sharing of data. And these essential requirements, really we're talking about, common sense, basic stuff as to when data has to be shared.
Yeah.
But moving forward, there's also what is known as the fallback mechanism for standardization, which is when these essential requirements, let's say, need an extra push in a specific sector for a specific type of data product, what have you, then the Commission come in and request one of the European standardization organizations to develop a harmonized standard. And that's exactly what's happening right now. The request should come out early 2025. And it's based on a few years' work, really, that has been going on specifically this issue as to how to make trusted data transactions.
Is the common vehicle data space part of that?
In a way, yes. So it's a lot to do also. So interoperability is needed to ensure that different sectors of the economy can speak to each other. And the Common European Mobility Data Space, I think the communication was adopted in November 2023, does or sets the scene, let's say, to bringing together the relevant stakeholders in the mobility ecosystem to understand what is the best way to address the issue of interoperability. And that is happening in the mobility sector, and it is also happening in the agricultural sector, in the energy sector. It's really a wide array. And ultimately, yes, the objective is to make sure that everything can work together.
Well, Martin, I saw you kind of nodding on about the Data Act and about this interoperability. Do you think that works? Is interoperability working now?
I think, when we come, especially on data spaces, I was assured to hear about it, because I don't know when the Commission and especially DG Move, I guess, who is in charge, announced that first, might be 2020. And by now, I don't know how many data spaces there are throughout Europe. Every mid-sized town has their own data space. And the problem here, it becomes a bit, bridging the gap between those that want to provide data and those that want to access data, because it's scattered around very many places. And it becomes difficult for the ones that want to find it to discover it. So discoverability, I think, is an issue. And here, I think the Commission could really add value in, making its data space, the mobility data space, when it comes, as some sort of a central hub where this brings all together what we need, and to also, have some sort of harmonization as to where to find the data, at least on the meta level, right?
So I think Antonio had something to add to that, right?
I absolutely agree that findability is one of the key principles, ultimately, the FAIR principles, and something that is embedded in all different actions that we're taking. But it's funny because there are indeed 14 common European data spaces that the Commission is, let's say, more proactively building. We're funding and developing various actions there. But data spaces ultimately are meant to be a bottom-up approach. We want hundreds of them to exist. That is, so be it at the national
That
level.
doesn't complicate interoperability or what?
Not necessarily if everyone speaks the same language. If
Okay.
everyone has the same foundation, that is where value is created, is by making sure that an actor in Estonia is able to get, that is, I don't know, in the energy sector, can get access to data that is generated by Portuguese washing machines. Why not? That is precisely the objective, and indeed that's why this interoperability layer is so crucial.
Maybe can I ask you the same thing, Andrei? I mean, how does interoperability work for you?
Well, I think, and maybe before we go that, the way I see it, and maybe this, let's say, puts in perspective what we heard today. I think, especially when we talk about automotive and mobility, I think we need to look at three categories of use cases and data. So one is, I would say, use case that's applicable for everyone, like safety. You know, that's the kind of things where I would say data collected from one OEM would also be beneficial for the other OEMs and vice versa, right? Cars are not driving alone. You're not only with your, let's say, the BMW drivers don't crash only against each other. They also meet other cars in the road. So that's the, you know, that's the first pillar where, and I think this is the part where, like, we, you know, data for road safety and SRTI that provides that there's a benefit for everyone to operate. Then I think there's data, and at least what I've seen, and also in the 4 keynote was interesting. There's data that's beneficial for specific type of user of a certain brand. You know, from this perspective, I would say, you know, the OEM X would benefit more in predicting and having better services and so on if they know what's happening. And then there's maybe also like a third category where there's data that only you as a user benefit. Like, for example, user-based insurance. Or I think even the Ford had a very good example with looking at diesel drivers that could actually be benefiting for switching to EV. You know, that's not the kind of things that might apply to everyone. This might apply as you as an individual. So that's why I think this data interoperability has to be also looked across these pillars. Of course, when it comes to data that everybody's benefiting, like, you know, data for road safety, it makes sense because otherwise you're not building the scale. If it's just siloed and you know, pockets of information here and there.
Okay. Is there a question or two out there? Not yet. I will continue. Sorry? We'll come back to you. Here's a question here. Give your name and title, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. It's Alvaro de la Cruz from FICHIFA, European Association of Parts Wholesalers and Distribution. Thank you for the conversation. It's really great to be discussing this with you guys. Regarding the Data Act, and it's been said before today and many times in the last months and years, the Data Act is enough, or let's not over-regulate and so on. I have a specific question because we're quite concerned about the scope of data and the sets of data that will be actually applicable to access to third parties through the Data Act. The Data Act itself in its text says that as it is a horizontal legislation applicable for any kind of connected device, we need vertical legislation specific for the different industries, specifically mention the automotive. That's why we're asking for a sector-specific legislation.
Vertical, so can you explain that vertical part?
Data Act is a horizontal legislation applicable to any connected device. And of course, an Airbus or a connected car is very different to a smart refrigerator. So as the sets of data and the scope of data is not universal, the Data Act doesn't contemplate entire sets of data, and there's a lot of concerns in the entire aftermarket about what kind of sets of data we will be accessing through the acceptance of the user. It's a very user-centered legislation. Could you explain what kind of data we can expect through the Data Act from 1 year onwards, and what kind of data will not be included?
Antonio, I guess that's your sandbox. Right?
Sure. So it's a big question. And it's really useful. I should say first and foremost that we've published a couple of months ago this quite extensive frequently asked questions document. And there you would find, really in better way that I can put it right now, an explanation of what data falls in scope, what data doesn't fall in scope of the Data Act. So I really invite you to look at it. But now I can also say like this, thinking from first and foremost from this balance of interests elements that I was describing earlier. The data in scope is such an element because there are certain investments that data holders have done to the data that really enrich it and create inferred or derived data. So that sort of data that has been what we say highly processed or highly enriched is out of scope. But raw data is definitely in scope. And here we include really the primary input data. But not only. because it's a spectrum ultimately, right? Because there is data that is processed and quote unquote enriched automatically to clean it up, to annotate it, that doesn't really require a high level of investment in it. And that's what the Data Act introduces. That's why the Data Act introduces a new concept, which is pre-processed data. And here it's really to make sure that, entities that would be on the receiving side of data can actually receive data that is also useful, usable. And I include the aftermarket service providers as well as consumers. Consumers also want to get some data that is, somewhat useful for their own good. So here it's and the Data Act has some recital language talking about this. For example, changes in quantity or physical values, speed, pH value, the light that is in a potential place where a camera picture, for instance. So these things are also considered as being pre-processed data. And on that data, the raw and pre-processed, this can be sent out to a related service provider and do whatever they want to do that is lawful, of course, with the data. Or they can also be used as data to develop new products, new services, what have you. So that's more or less the frame, and there's a lot more to be said, but in short, that's it.
Is there anything in the Data Act about monetizing data or not?
Yeah, it's a really good question because
it costs money to gather the data too, right?
Yes, absolutely. So that's a really good question because so the Data Act is linked to the Data Governance Act, as I said earlier. And there we already start talking about these so-called neutral data intermediaries. These will be essentially orchestrators of common European data spaces, and not only. More importantly, they bring together those who have data with those who seek to use the data. So for example, a data marketplace. In this place, an entity that has, or myself, for example, I have IoT objects at home, a smart washing machine, my homeware devices. The data that is produced by these devices, I could theoretically monetize on it. I could approach a neutral data intermediary and say, hey, I got this data being generated at home. I want to sell it off to someone. And then that someone might be an aftermarket service provider who is very interested in getting access to this data and now has the means, the platform to do so. So yes, monetization of data is of non-personal data specifically is something that we're keen to do as well.
Okay. Any other question out there? Everybody happy? Compliance. What about compliance? Compliance with the current regulatory landscape involving over 20 different regulations. What are the challenges in ensuring that compliance? Is there not one sort of the buck stops here desk at the European Commission? Because you got all these DGs with different rules, right?
Well, there's obviously very close work that we do across services of the Commission to make sure that what gets adopted is ultimately coherent. And in the mission letter to EVP designate Virkkunen, as well in the hearings, you heard this a lot, that we're going to be working on a European Data Union strategy. And this is ultimately to make sure that the existing rules that we have on data work as they're meant to be.
So then her team would be the enforcers then?
Not necessarily.
No?
My point being more that we hear the feedback. We hear the concerns of all sorts of actors in our society saying there's a lot of reporting obligations, there's a lot of compliance that we have to do, and it's difficult. And so we're listening to that, and actually there will be in the future a concerted effort to make sure that everything works properly.
Martin, any opinion on that?
We talked about that before, and you mentioned these 20 plus regulations, and Austria has listed them on their website, I think, so you can look them up. But if you just think about it, it's DG GROW that mandates for vehicle manufacturers to share data on type approval matters, on safety. We have DG Move on various items. We had traffic safety and traffic data.
Sure.
There is DG Energy on charging data. There is DG Home on judicial data for vehicles. There is DG Envy on emission data. And, of course, DG Connect with the Data Act and the DGA.
Let me count the ways.
You name them. sometimes it's really challenging for us. And we had, I think, previously the conversation about public or data for the public good and what happens. We come as a manufacturer in a situation where the consumer says, I don't want to share any data. I switch it off. But still, we're obliged under certain laws to share the data with either the commission or national authorities. So we're in that cleavage as to consumer doesn't want to share data. They said, don't activate my modem. I don't want it.
Right.
On the other hand, we have authorities opening up their hands and saying, please give it to us. Now, this is one example. The other, as we talked about monetization of the Data Act, is Renewable Energy Directive. We had that on the slides, I think, earlier on, where suddenly for certain data points, the principles of the Data Act are not applicable anymore because DG Energy decided that monetization for data concerning charging of vehicles has a different meaning. Fair enough, but as we're now building our compliance strategies for the year to come with the Data Act and Renewable Energy Directive, it brings us into problems as to how to leverage all of that. And I think coming to how should that be in the future, we definitely need some sort of strategy as to what is the Commission's actual goal and which problems do they want to solve. Because my feeling for now is, and I don't want to offend anyone, is that it's a lot of piecemeal, that different DGs do their work and often very well intended, but there's an overall picture missing. And maybe DG Connect can be that connection that brings everyone together. Thank you. The Dutch, they're saving me again here. Be that connection, because I'm not doing that very often, but I want to make a compliment to the team of DG Connect on the Data Act. While it's certainly not an easy legislation, neither for us, not for everyone, I think what you've done there is quite comprehensive and also shows quite deep knowledge of data sharing on the market.
Andrei, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think for me, maybe if I can refer to a specific use case, the SRTI, so the Safety-Related Traffic Information, which is something that existed for 10 years. And I think maybe an idea to consider part of this actually never took off to the full potential because there was kind of like not really clarity of what's expected from the actors, also not very clear about the business models and so on. So maybe this can actually act as a learning to say, hey, this is it, and industry needs to get prepared for it, and then let's go with it before we invent something else.
What about simplification? What steps could European lawmakers take to simplify and harmonize this legal framework of more than 20 different regulations? Any suggestions within the panel?
I think, if I can start, Chris,
okay.
What people could do is, first of all, look what works and what not. There's still some room for interpretation on the Data Act, and I've heard from Antonio's colleagues that some of it might only be solved afterwards because we need to see how it works in practice and maybe readjust. And that for me is one of the key things in the future, to look what works, how it works, and then build up on that, rather than preempting all of this and say, by the way, we still have XYZ and we still need to do that because we said that in 2019 that we need to build something else. So that is something I really would like to avoid. The other thing in general, and here the Commission tends to do that, is too prescriptive rules in terms of the technology being used. And we're seeing that here at the moment in the automotive industry on eCall, right? Some of you might be familiar with that, which is a safety technology mandated in all the vehicles that calls emergency services if you have an accident. And very well intended and good technology. The problem is, Commission specified that it must use 2G and 3G connections. So every vehicle by law has to be equipped with that. Problem is, we're seeing that telematics and telecommunications provider are now switching off 2G and 3G because it's not viable for them anymore. They're moving to 4G, 5G, and potentially even 6G. But there's still these old vehicles that have to be equipped with that technology by law. So, when we think about connected vehicle, mandating certain things, certain data points or whatsoever that are outdated by the minute they're published on some Commission guidance, I think that is something we should definitely avoid.
Any suggestions, Andrei?
Yeah, but maybe I'm going to make if you talk about simplification, I'm going to give a very simple example. Think about data as in, let's make the analogy with rainwater, right? Rainwater, even if it falls from the sky, is still not ready to be drinkable, right? You have to process it, you have to collect it, you have to distribute it. So I think also from the perspective of the data flow, we have to make sure that there are business incentives both, because also on the OEM side, there are costs. Free data that comes it's actually not free because you have to put the hardware, you have to put the data connectivity, and then in between there's a middle of people processing and then refining it and then bringing it that. So I think from this perspective, if this is always kept in sight, I think we can get there. Yeah, as a simple example, I would say.
Okay. Any reaction to that, Antonio?
No, yeah.
The 2
So
points?
very good points. I can only agree. I think that the efforts that the Commission is going to be doing in the next mandate, if I can speculate a bit, because ultimately there's a lot to be decided still,
Sure.
but it is a lot driven by this burden reduction, administrative burden reduction. So I can only say that from our side, we're looking at different mechanisms to reach that goal,
Mhm.
be it in the legal point of view, or be it in more technological common European data spaces, what have you, as usage as well. AI, who knows,
Yeah.
might also play a role here. And then, yeah, just a general, let's say, statement as well, which is that it's important for us to talk and hear with, and to talk and hear from the stakeholder community as well, what exactly is needed. So in the next few months, at least, this sort of effort, a consultation, so to speak, would very much make sense, so that we really, gather input to think about how exactly the simplification should be done. Because of course,
Yeah.
we can all have, we might think in our brilliant minds that we have the solution for everything, but no, sometimes we really don't, and it's good to hear from you.
Yeah, sure. And,
as
and,
well.
and quite often legislation has it built in that you have to revisit it
It does.
in 5 years
Yeah.
to see how it's going, if it needs to be tweaked at all. What about improving data sharing? How can we continue to improve and increase data sharing? Is the current legal framework adequate? Maybe we get it from the private sector first. I guess,
Right. I mean,
From
I
Ford.
think we've touched upon many things already before, Chris. We talked about data spaces and discoverability of data. I think one point, if I have to reflect upon myself, or at least my company and our sector in general, that could be certainly improved, is the standardization aspect. I think Federico mentioned that earlier as well. Here, there is our industry efforts. We are members of CUVISA, the Connected Vehicle Standardization Alliance. I think here and other members present here are as well, from the broader sector, vehicle manufacturers, but also suppliers. But that is something that could be maybe fostered and even receive some support from the Commission or from national authorities, where these efforts are being streamlined and pushed, so that it's easier for everyone to use that data in the future.
Okay, Andrei, I think I had a conversation with you about this before, and I think one point that you had was the quality of the data.
Yeah.
That's what is kind of begging to be improved, right?
Yeah, and before we get to that, the
Okay.
quality, I think that's a good point. I'll touch about it. I also maybe refer to kind of like the overall, because sometimes it's not black and white. And I'm aware that, for example, Klemmer is very much in favor for sector specific regulation, which it's true, because at the end of the day, things that could be applied, for your washing machine manufacturer will not probably apply for a different, let's say, type of player. And for us, and here I'm talking on behalf of our company only, we're more in the data and services that can benefit everyone, not just a specific, well, let's say, OEM or type of user. So having said this, now getting also in the quality of data, and this again, I talk from our experience of working with millions of vehicles that are providing data. Actually, not all the data is usable. There's a lot of noise into the data.
You got to separate the wheat from the chaff.
In
right?
many cases, and there are places like, for example, if I take Germany as an example, where actually we don't have a problem that we don't have enough data. We have a problem that we have too much data that actually needs to be, let's say, put aside, because it just doesn't. And it also comes from the vehicles, right? Not all the vehicles have the same hardware, but they don't have the same capability to give you certain types of data. Even simple things like GPS. A vehicle might be in the same place, but they report data into different places because, they just have different hardware that's calibrated differently.
Sure.
So I think that's, or at least from our perspective, that's important to also factor in.
Okay. Another question here? Anyone? Just got a couple of minutes left. One that comes to mind is, I guess we might have touched on it, but with a new administration coming in Washington, how could that have bearing on the use of data in Europe? Could there be, there'll be different regulation. There might be a loosening of regulation in the US. How could that impact here? I mean, it's very, very difficult. Do you have a crystal ball, maybe?
If anyone does, let me know. I would love to look into it.
Or are you at least like wargaming, thinking,
Yeah.
well, it could be that, it could be that. So we got to be ready for both, right? I know trade defense, you got the tools ready for trade defense, right?
Well, not getting into that specifically, because I think we have to say that the US is our largest trade partner. It's our a trusted transatlantic ally, and it will continue to be so.
Yeah.
And the fact that they have different ways of looking at data is absolutely fine. It's under their jurisdiction, and we have our own European way of handling data. And that's what we will continue to do in the context of the next mandates. In the European data strategy of 2020, there was this, let's call it our guiding objective, our approach to international data flows. It's to be open but assertive. And that's what we will continue to do. There might be, some shifts in terms, or in order to reflect the different geopolitical ecosystem that we live in compared to 2019, 2020.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, this is very much what we will continue to do. Our work with our American counterparts has always been, very fruitful. And when we have our college, and when President Trump will be confirmed, I believe on the 20th of January, then we'll have a new relationship starting.
Yeah, because with the current administration, I think you were closer in the mindset-wise, you were closer to each other. So this sort of departure on the other side of the Atlantic could impact certain companies, maybe those that work on both sides of the lake, like Ford, GM. No, that's not what you look at?
I don't think so. I mean, coming to the specificities of our company in terms of trade, I think Europe works for Europe and the US works for the US. So, in terms of our business setup, we're quite safe. And I'd say the same for the data. There's little data flowing between the two continents, and if so, it's all within the legal safeguards and remits that have been established by the Commission. I think this is all fine. What is interesting, though, and what we can maybe see in the US is how a new administration will deal with data laws in the US, how this will affect data companies in the US. Maybe learn or observe at least what happens there. Because one thing, and that is clear, the data world, the data companies, the data monetization, that's happening not here in Europe, at least not for now. Maybe the Data Act changes that, but it does in your end of the world, in California. So maybe something to observe and maybe take lessons from in 5 years, and we catch up and see where we go.
Let's do. How about from GM? Add to that?
Maybe I will not. Well, I would say exactly the same as for Ford. I mean, we have a similar company, so what is valid for Ford is valid for GM. But since you enlarge the topic to other regions, I would like to ask you a question, the three of you, on a topic which does not make very much the headlines, but concerning data, which is the cross-border data flow mechanism and the discussion that are being held between the European Commission and our Chinese friends. Can you tell us more about that and how this would affect indeed the future market for data?
Antonio?
Sure. So the cross-border data flow communication mechanism, if I'm not mistaken, was launched in August. There have been contacts at a high political level already, let's say, declaring what the intention with this communication mechanism is, and as well as expert level meetings. And the purpose of this communication mechanism is really for the EU to get an opportunity to voice some of the concerns that European companies in China are facing when having to, handle data in China, but also export their data out of China. And particularly in the automotive sector, there are several hindrances. And the colleagues in DG Trade, they are very much, let's say, in the loop or talking to stakeholders in the automotive sector, as well as other sectors that are present in China. And ultimately, the objective is indeed to ensure that whatever data has to flow out of China can do so, as unimpeded as possible. So identifying specific technical trade irritants and making sure that, one, they're either justified properly by our counterparts, or at least mitigated to ensure that the European businesses can operate as intended, let's say, in a foreign market.
Great. Antonio, Andrei, Martin?
Yeah, maybe I might comment on that, but I'm not going to answer your question. I'm just reinforce what you said from this perspective, because I'm going to be very honest here. When we deal with China, our company as well, not in China, outside of China, but when we looked at what they're doing there in terms of data-driven services, we're just blown away, honestly. And to be honest, this is not possible to be done in Europe with the current data sets and what's out there. So I think there's a big gap in innovation, not just because European companies don't have the algorithms or the AI tools and so on, but the way the data foundation that they have is a different level. And I think to your point, we know that they're they want to expand, right? They also want to come here. Maybe we also want to, let's say, to be able to build similar services that are useful for. But yeah, the data itself is an important thing that it's used very differently.
Martin, are you good with that, or you want to add? You're fine, huh?
All fine.
Thank you very much, these wonderful panel.